Good afternoon, honourables, delegates, dear participants and guests, and welcome to Plenary 2, Energy for Transport Toward a Just and Sustainable Transition. My name is Geraldine de Bastion, and I have the honour of moderating this plenary session for you, and would like to introduce the topic before we begin with the discussion. So decarbonisation of the transport sector, as you all know, is of course critical to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And in a way, many of the interventions and policies that are needed to achieve that decarbonisation are known, but progress in implementation has not been fast enough. Now, of course, here at ITF, we like to offer a stage and give space to advocating the long-term kind of goals and decision-making and policy planning that we need for the decarbonisation of the transport system. And that is what we want to do now in the next 1.5 hours. We want to give space to discuss what governments needs to do to really develop comprehensive strategies for the future of mobility. The energy sources and transport infrastructures needed. We also want to discuss what signals governments need to send to the public, to the private sector, and to civil society through targeted transport policies. And of course, to discuss the ways that we can support measures, also, of course, the kind of evaluation and monitoring systems, but what was really needed to aid this transition and to speed it up in order to reach our worldwide goals, and of course keeping this a worldwide discussion. Those are the topics we want to address in this panel session, and I'd now like to introduce our distinguished panelists to you. To my right, Arun Thangaraj was appointed Deputy Minister of Transport on February 20th last year. Before joining the Transport Canada, Arun was the Associate Deputy Minister at Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship in Canada, and also Associate Deputy Minister at Transport Canada. So it's really great to have you here today representing Canada. Arun, welcome. To my left, I would like to welcome Magda Kopczyńska. She is currently the Director General for Mobility and Transport in the European Commission. Magda has held various leadership roles for the Commission, from clean transport to sustainable urban mobility to agriculture and rural development, and is really committed on driving the positive change in the European mobility sector. Lovely to have you here today. I would also like to welcome Karin Svensson. She's the Chief Sustainability Officer at the Volvo Group, with responsibility to drive the sustainability agenda at Volvo. Karin has worked in several roles and functions, including public affairs, strategy, and research and development at Volvo since 1996, and has been active in a number of transport-related external groups as well, in Sweden, Belgium, the US, just to name a few. She was chairman of the board at SAFER, the Vehicle and Transport Safety Centre at Chalmers University, and is currently also on the board of the International Women Forum in Sweden. Lovely to have you. Next to Karin, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gianluca Ambrosetti. He is the CEO and co-founder of Synhelion, which is a Swiss clean energy company that uses solar energy to produce carbon-neutral solar fuel to decarbonize transportation. The fuels produced by Synhelion include solar kerosene, gasoline, and diesel. And this is going to come in very importantly in our discussion when we zoom in a little bit on fuel alternatives. So great to have you here, Gianluca. And two more to go, not last but not least. Next to Gianluca is Tanya Bryja. She is ExxonMobil's Vice President of Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, responsible for energy products as well, based in Brussels, Belgium. Tanya holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Chemical Engineering from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, USA, and she received this degree in the same year, 1997, as she began her career with ExxonMobil. It's great to have you here as well, Tanya. And now, last but not least in our round, I'd like to introduce to you Luis Felipe de Oliveira. He has led Airport Council International World as Director General since June 2020, has applied his vast experience in commercial and technical aviation in this role, and is really supporting, playing a crucial role in fostering social and economic growth at the same time as, of course, the transition of the sector to a more carbon neutral field. So it's fantastic to have you here as well. I'd like to begin this discussion by allowing opening remarks from each of our speakers, and after that we're going to engage in a discussion together, and I'll tell you a little bit more how I thought we'd structure the discussion. But first, I'd like to pass the floor to you for your opening remarks. Deputy Minister, please.
Thank you so much. It's almost like I forgot to unmute myself on a Zoom call.
It's so cozy in the center here.
Happens a lot. But no, it's great to be here, and it's great to be with such great speakers. And, you know, throughout the last 2 days, we've heard how important transportation is to a thriving economy, and an economy that includes people and provides economic opportunity. And that's particularly true in Canada. And so when we think about you know, a more green and sustainable transportation system, there's unique challenges that we face. We are a vast geography with dispersed population, with not so quite hospitable winters, and that creates challenges for alternative fuels. And so we are heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and it's about a quarter of our overall emissions. And I think you do have hard edge cases with respect to transition. And so I think the conversation today and what we're doing here at the ITF becomes really important, because for us it's a realization that we cannot do this in and of ourselves, that how we transition, what an interim fuel is, what an end state is, the policy levers that we have are not going to be uniquely Canadian. They're going to be you know, shamelessly plagiarized from our friends in different jurisdictions, and understanding what works and what doesn't. And I think that becomes important. And so we really value these types of discussions, but working with international fora, but also with the private sector in terms of what is working and what they're thinking about to facilitate our transition. I think because, you know, it is so hard, but I think the other thing for Canada is we are at the forefront of climate change. I was with one of our foremost journalists last week, and he was talking about being in the Arctic and being there 10 years ago and being there last year, and the visible differences due to climate change. We have wildfire seasons that span not 2 months, but 6 months out of our year. And so there is an imperative for us to do something. And so the partnerships that we establish through fora like this, and the discussions today are just very helpful. So very happy to be a part of it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to pass the floor to you, Magda, for your opening remarks, please. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me to this panel with this topic of towards a just and sustainable transition. I've been thinking you probably copied that topic from one of many European Commission, European Union documents of the past 5 years, because this has been one of the lead themes. In addition, of course, to us managing all the ongoing crises, starting with COVID, and then of course dealing with assisting Ukraine faced with the war and unjustified full-scale aggression. I really appreciate the timing of having that conversation, also having that conversation here in ITF, which, as Arun said, allows me to look a little bit beyond of what we are doing, what we have been doing on a daily basis in the EU. I like to think we've been pretty strong, some may say maybe too strong, over the last couple of years when it comes to putting the need to decarbonize European economy, including European transport. There was a very clear message in 2019 from the President in her first speech to the Parliament that all sectors have to contribute. I think it was one of the first occasions when we're so strong and clear that this is what needs to happen. We have a very solid regulatory framework in place. We need to implement that framework. And this discussion on what works, what doesn't in terms of implementation, and how to make that implementation work, not for policymakers, but for those who need to deal with that implementation. And how shall we address this just aspect of the transition, because this is an extremely important point. But it's also to take a bit of stock in terms of where we are and what we will be putting on the table when it comes to the next regulatory or legislative mandate, with the European Parliament elections 2 weeks from now, with the new College of Commissioners coming into place. So I really appreciate the perfect timing for my own reflection on the issues lying ahead of decarbonization of transport.
Thank you so much. Already so many commonalities of you pointing out the social aspects and of course the importance to give the right pace and not leave anybody behind. May I ask you to go next, Felipe?
Yeah, good afternoon. A pleasure to be here again in ITF. You know, is a place that you really have such a good discussions and make as a good reflections as well to take the actions that you need to take as an industry. I would like to talk a little bit of ACI first. We are graciously hosted by the Canadian government in Canada. We are close to ICAO. And ACI is a confederated organization. That's why we have 5 different regions in the world, linked with our board members, linked with our executive committee members that comes from the regions. And basically our main efforts are discuss with ICAO global rules for our sector. Aviation is a global industry. That's why for us it's important that we are able to apply the same approach globally speaking, and we need to support the actions from ICAO because different parts of the world have different maturity in any kind of subjects, but we need to try to harmonize the system, especially safety security, but more than ever, sustainability is a key for us. And of course, one thing that is started to be very important for us is the passenger first. There is no industry if we don't have the passenger. That's why we cannot talk about the airlines, we cannot talk about the airports. We need to talk about the passenger. We need to talk about the ecosystem that is support aviation. Aviation, together with the tourist sector, represent 10% of the global economy. And that brings us to a position that we are key contributors for the socio-economic development. And I would like to say a little bit more. We are contributing to the sustainability, the social economic development, sustainable development of the world in certain ways. The pandemic showed that aviation is a very important sector. Different parts of the world have different needs in terms of aviation, but it's still a sector that is very important and contributes heavily to the global economy, contribute heavily to the socio-economic development for the countries that we serve.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Gianluca, may I ask you to go next?
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. I hope that I can give a bit an insight from the, let's say, the renewable fuels side. And I would like to start by making a few statements about sustainable fuel and their all flavors, renewable fuels, low carbon fuels. What are they? They are substantially chemically identical to fossil fuels. However, they entail with the usage significantly lower CO2 emissions. How can you make them? I mean, there are several pathways, some more established, some less. Important is to state that we have nowadays all the tools, all the technologies to cover demand. We don't need breakthrough innovation. We have this already. And these technologies may range to things that you have already heard, like biofuels, can be more or less advanced biofuels. There are very, very promising pathways with that. There are electric fuels, e-fuels, or power-to-liquid fuels, where you go through electrolysis of water to hydrogen, and then there is a downstream chain to come to the fuel, as well as, for instance, what we do, we use renewable solar heat, because it's the cheapest and the most abundant renewable energy source on the planet. The energy cost is very important for the cost of fuel. However, I think the most important common denominator of all of this is that these technologies exist, they need to complement each other, and they can be used synergically. They are not one or the other. We need them all. It's not going to be a winner takes it all. All these technologies need to grow and scale because we need them all. Why do we need them? Why do we need fuel at all? Electrification can do a lot, and we do not believe that we should compete with electrification. Fuels do not need to compete with electrification. However, they need to complement because they are sectors which cannot forego to the amazing properties of liquid hydrocarbon fuels, especially the gravimetric and volumetric energy density. 70 times more than a battery, 60 times whatever, this order of magnitude. You will not make in the short time an airplane that can fly long haul with batteries. However, you can do electric planes. There are many interesting companies doing amazing things in this, but long haul, you will still need these unique features of liquid hydrocarbon fuels. Shipping is the same, long distance transportation on the road as well. And I hope that with this, I've given you a bit of flavor why we do need this very, very important tool to the decarbonization of transportation.
Thank you. I think very helpful for everybody to make sure we're on the same page, understanding what we're talking about when we say alternative fuels. Thanks very much for that, Gianluca. Karin, your opening remarks, please.
Thank you. So the Volvo Group, we are ready to contribute to achieving climate neutrality in transportation by 2050 with the right enabling conditions in place. Today, approximately 95% of the emissions from our business comes from when our products, trucks, buses are out on the road, which means tackling downstream emissions is going to be crucial for us. So just as we heard, there are going to be not one technology, but several technologies. We think that battery electric vehicles, fuel cell electric vehicles, but also continuing with the internal combustion engine with then more sustainable fuels in it will need to be used. In addition to that, it's also important to decarbonize the upstream emissions. That means the materials and the components that goes into our vehicles. Electrification then is not something new to us. We've been selling electric buses and for more than 10 years. We have a full lineup of electric trucks available for anyone to buy. But the availability of vehicles won't be enough. We've heard many times already that there are things not in place. We do not have enough of charging infrastructure. We do not have enough of fossil-free energy or electricity to go into those vehicles. And we need to have an electricity grid fit for purpose in order to do that. And all this needs coordination and different types of policy measures. But as we heard from one of the previous speakers, the transition to sustainable transportation, it's not going to be enough to have a green transition. It also needs to be just. This implies that we need to have a more comprehensive view of what sustainability means. It's not only environment, but it's also to ensure that we can transform, not at the expense of someone or some groups. As a business, we have a crucial role to play, but governments also have a crucial role to play, not in the least to set public procurement selection criteria that goes beyond price. I think together is the name of the game, and that's why I'm so happy to be here today, and I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you so much, Karin. Very many important points raised there. Definitely want to pick up on the charging infrastructure topic later. And now, Tanya, please, your opening remarks.
Thanks, Geraldine. I appreciate it. It's my first ITF summit and very excited to be here. It's so nice to see how much commonality we actually have, despite some differences on the edges. We have a huge challenge at hand to transition our entire energy system over the next couple of decades. And today, transportation emissions are about a quarter of global emissions, and it is just a formidable challenge for all of us, public, private, academia, individual consumers. So what we believe at ExxonMobil is really three things have to come together: technology, policy, and affordability. And affordability really comes into the just side. Let me start with technology. I've spent a lot of my career in technology, and if I look back a couple of decades, the things that we thought and exactly how we thought things would transpire didn't exactly happen, but a lot of things have happened, and it's required perhaps not breakthroughs, but certainly significant advancements in technology. And one of the key things is there will not be a one-size-fits-all. You are going to have a lot of different options because the energy transition is going to take everything. It's going to take all we have as society to come together and make these changes and make a more sustainable future. It's really important that we have lower emission fuels, whether they're biological origin, synthetic origin, electricity, hydrogen, anything we can bring to bear, because it's all going to be needed. And it's all going to have to be, at some point in its time, supported by the right policies. And the policies that are set up, they can really increase the speed decrease the cost if they're set up appropriately. And by set up appropriately, it's such that policies are durable, they're predictable, they provide a structure where investors who are investing for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, can do that with some degree of certainty. We know the markets will move, there will be changes, but we need some of that certainty. We also believe in focusing on the problem at hand, which is CO2 emissions. So that means don't pick a winner and a loser, just look at carbon intensity, look at the life cycle of that, look at the fuel, look at the vehicle, look at the ship, whatever we're looking at from a hardware standpoint, and don't focus on just a tailpipe on the road sector, but look holistically. And then if you look at affordability, it needs public support to get started. When you have early technologies, nascent technologies, you need that public support to catalyze, to get us moving along the pathway, to start bringing things down the learning curve. And it will eventually bring the cost down too. And that's what we really need for the market to adopt. Governments cannot afford, they're not in a position to afford supporting everything for forever. We need to make these market solutions, we need to make them affordable. So bringing all technologies to bear, being technology inclusive, having ambitious targets, and then allowing us to follow that trajectory is really important. So what we need to do is we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we want to have options to do that. We don't want to reduce the options for making that happen.
Thank you so much, Tanya. That's a great segue into the way I thought we'd kick off our conversation, because I thought we'd begin by talking about what are these policy frameworks and what really are the key technologies that we're talking about here, before we perhaps zoom in on the topic of alternative fuels and electrification. So starting with this sort of perhaps mapping of policies and technologies. I'm looking over to you. I'm sorry, like squeezing in an anecdote here, because you mentioned people and also transportation needs. And of course, aviation plays such a fundamental role in keeping our globe connected. This morning in the news, I saw a new airline being launched offering luxury flights for dogs as domestic flights across the US. So of course now we don't want to talk about mobility cultures and people's needs. That's not our topic, but energy for transport. But looking at aviation perhaps first, can you give us a little bit of an overview from your perspective, what the policies really are that can drive this, that can accelerate the development and adoption of new technologies and fuels in this sector?
It's very interesting, because basically, of course, I need to start to talk about the airports, but with my background in the fuel, I will go and end up in the fuel side at the end. But we as an airport, we have 2,110 members in the world, and that will represent 95% of the global traffic. We have a program that we started in 2012 that is airport carbon accreditation, how we can decarbonize our airports. And the European airports are, some of them already reaching net zero carbon emissions by our airports. That's why basically we are already achieving the level 5. That is a very important level in terms of the highest level in terms of decarbonization for the airports. It is a program that we implement all over the world, because aviation sector is global. And for us, it's important that the policies comes and our own ambitions needs to come and needs to turn global. If we think about what we are working with ICAO, the most important part in terms of the decarbonization of the sector is the sustainable aviation fuels. And we finally were able, in the CAF 3, that was next November in Dubai, we are able to set an ambitious target for the globe that is 5% of carbon, no, it's not carbon reduction, it's intensity, carbon intensity reduction until 2030. And that comes with the policies now, how we implement the policy, how we make this happen. If we analyze that we have a problem of supply demand that is critical, if you don't have the supply and you have the demand, prices goes up, and nobody will be able to use, independent of the policy that someone you need to pay the price at the end, you know. So one of our issues is how we can incentivize the production of the sustainable aviation fuels. And we see different policies in different parts of the world. For example, US is more than subsidy side. That's why basically you have a fuel moving from all over the world, sustainable aviation fuel, to the US, to be consumed in US. European Union adopt a little bit a different approach in terms of the targets in the mix of the sustainable aviation fuels in the sector. But you know, if we don't manage the supply demand, we don't manage the problem. And to create stability, that I think you mentioned very well, the stability, that we have the stability in terms of the investor, we have stability in terms of the consumer. We need to have ways that there is some kind of incentives and mandates that to be linked with the process. Means we need to have financial incentives for the production to turn this product viable to be a supply and demand approach. That's why to turn a commodity. We don't control the price of the fuel around the world. We don't control the price of ethanol around the world. And ethanol is a very specific case. You know, when the ethanol started, for example, we didn't have a commodity price for ethanol. Nowadays, we have a commodity price because we have a production, we have a supply demand for that. So if you create a supply demand, for me, it's critical for that. And that comes in three parts. We need to incentivize the use, we need to finance this production, and we need to, in my personal view, we need to mix a kind of incentives and mandates to make that happen in the future. There is a very interesting approach from the Singaporean government. For example, they create a blueprint approach. There is a study they did with a lot of different professionals from oil companies, airlines, airports. We are also part of that. And what they did, they create exactly that. They are planning to create the supply demand, and the government is controlling that in certain ways with a value attached to the price of the ticket that you generate. They started to consume this fuel that comes from the user at the end, you know. So there is a lot of ways to do that, but in certain ways, we need to deal with the supply demand. Supply demand is very important. And the sustainable aviation fuels is the first part, especially for the aviation sector, considering that we have around 15,000 aircrafts with the technology that already can consume sustainable aviation fuels from 50 to 100%. And these aircrafts will be in the market for the next 30, 40 years. So until we have an aircraft that will be a hydrogen aircraft that will be able to fly overseas, we need to invest in sustainable aviation fuels, in low carbon aviation fuels that will be the way that you can reach this carbon emissions reduction that the industry needs to achieve to continue to provide the socio-economic developments that I mentioned at the beginning. So we have a very hard task ahead. We have the technology in our side. I think that is good. We have the aircrafts and engines in our side. That is good. But what we need to know how the policies around the world will help us to have a global production, a global approach that will support the production and the incentive of the production of sustainable aviation fuels around the world. I can go on talking about hydrogen, electricity, but I think if not, it will monopolize the discussion, and we can continue later.
Maybe we can, in the next round, add a bit more detail to that then, if you like. But let's continue with the mapping first, and then we'll zoom in a little bit. So, Arun, maybe turning to land transport, maybe you can outline, keeping the Canadian connection going here for a minute. What are the policies needed there to really make sure that the adoption of electric vehicles is taking place, as well as the production of cleaner fuels?
So I'll pick up, one of the things that you said in Exxon strategy is a key component is affordability. And I think that's where we've started with the transition to electric or zero emission vehicles. And it was a public policy that, at the federal level provided purchase incentives, and often that was matched by other level of governments, because we know that price is a barrier to entry. And, initially, and still to a large extent, 10% of new vehicle sales in Canada are electric vehicles, but you're still in that early adopter kind of phase of market transformation. So it isn't really widespread. And so part of it is on, can you address affordability and deal with demand, as you said. And I think on the other side, if we look a little bit long-term, is looking at supply. And so Canada's introducing a supply mandate for zero-emission vehicles as well. And so that manufacturers will have to supply the Canadian market with sufficient vehicles. And again, there's been tremendous investment in, for example, Volkswagen, Honda, recently Stellantis, about electric vehicle production in Canada, a component for that, again, to address the issue of supply. And I think the intention really is can you, goose demand enough to generate to start dropping prices, but then supplement that with increased supply, which will, again, address the challenge of affordability. I think the other barrier really is charging infrastructure. As I said, Canada is a large and cold place. The last thing you want to be, you talk about range anxiety, and cars have more range than people actually drive. But when you're confronted with being very cold in a car without range, that's a whole different level of range anxiety. And so there has been a lot of effort in increasing charging infrastructure. We've worked with our American colleagues to look at charging corridors, for example, from Quebec City down to Kalamazoo, Michigan, so that those longer journeys can have a steady supply of fuel. The second part of your question was on fuel. I will defer to the expertise on this side of the panel, but I think there's a recognition from a policy standpoint that we do have to incentivize the adoption of clean technology and clean fuel that's low carbon. And so there are clean fuel regulations that were promulgated in 2022. But also in our last budget, the $500 million was allocated to subsidizing the production of biofuels, and an additional $800 million from our carbon pricing to be available for development of alternative fuels. And there's a number of boutique programs on the marine side and on sustainable aviation fuel. And so I think there's a consumer approach, a focus on consumer approach, but also on the fuel side. I do want to touch on the issue of just transition, right? And so I can talk to you about Canadian policies, and they're interesting to Canadians. But when you think about an EV transition land-based, it's not just developed economies that have to undertake this shift. Right? It is emerging economies, and I think we have to be mindful that the vehicle ecosystem is different in different places, and therefore the transition is going to be different. So I think there's a question for how we support that transition, because in certain countries it's two-wheelers that you are doing transition off of, and what is the labor ecosystem? What is the disruption that you create when you do this? And so I do think we do have to be mindful that it's a transition that has to happen, and we have to support domestically, and we do that, but also in terms of justice, how the rest of the world makes that transition as well.
Thank you so much for making that point. I think it's such an important point to add. I think there's so much innovation and ingenuity out there. I have a friend developing solar taxis in Ghana, for instance, but these are all very grassroots or small pilot initiatives. How do we get this at scale and really reach people across the countries that are, they're really facing a whole set of different challenges regarding climate change effects already, but also the affordability issue that you raised. Magda, I'm sure a lot of the points that Arun raised also resonate from a European perspective, so I'd love to hear from you next, maybe looking across the transport system. What are the key policies that are driving this whole uptake of low emission solutions in the EU? And maybe you just want to also add to the points your fellow speakers made already.
Thank you. And I do recall that at some point you were telling us before the meeting that you really wouldn't like us to speak for a very long time. So here's the challenge. Can somebody switch off this mic if I never stop speaking?
Please take the floor. Go ahead.
And when you were introducing me, you referred to the fact that I spent some time, very short, but still working on agriculture. And I just realized that I'm going to bring two sort of farm-related concepts. One is a basket of measures, and the other one is chicken or egg problem. Because when we were putting this regulatory framework on the table in 2019, 2020, 2021, I realized, listening also to all the interventions here, that we very quickly started to take things for granted now that 5 or 10 years ago were absolutely not there. 5 or 10 years ago, the main thing we're hearing is aviation and shipping, impossible sectors to decarbonize. There's no technology, we have no solution, that will not happen ever. And we need disruptive technology. And then over the last couple of years, we realized that, well, disruption is there because we are looking at zero emission alternative fuels, but it's a completely different type of disruption than having a hydrogen powered plane. So solutions have found a way. The scale of transition in land-based transportation is also happening much faster than we had envisaged before. So this, when we put what we used to call Fit for 55 policy package, because we agreed on this target of reduction of emissions at the EU level by 55% by 2030, we try to address all aspects of the ecosystem. We looked at vehicles/ships/planes. We looked at infrastructure. We looked at energy production, and we looked at funding and financing. And even though not all the elements are fully there yet, or some of them may be up to change, I don't really believe that we can look at transition without trying to address all those elements. Creating demand for alternative fuels, especially when it comes to shipping and aviation, by putting in place binding targets for 2025, 2030, increasing all the way to 2050. Putting in place mandatory targets for infrastructure development, including charging infrastructure. Again, binding targets, because if they are not binding, they don't give the predictability and certainty. Looking at the aspects of energy production, because when we are talking about renewable energy sources, we want to make sure that we have the same understanding what renewable energy is, and how it is defined, whether it comes to energy or transport. And finally, putting in place funding and financing instruments to support the transition. And there are two types of support that I would like to mention here. One was aimed at assisting EU member states, but also industries, in trying to bridge the gap, develop things faster or develop things cheaper in order to meet those binding targets that we had put in place. I know there's often this comparison that in the US we have IRA, so it's easy money thrown to speed up the production of among other things, sustainable aviation fuels, but also other fuels. But in the EU, with working with the system that we have in place with emission trading scheme, with SAF allowances, zero carbon rating for SAF fuels, also using money from ETS into Innovation Fund to push for projects that could facilitate that transition, I think we are not that far away in terms of amount of money that is committed, but granted, the money is committed in a different way. In our case, we want the SAFs to be there, and then we sort of pay back for the fact that you have SAFs in place. But there's also financing, but maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it later when it comes to development of infrastructure. But there's another dimension of the financial support, and here I touch upon this just transition, because of course, we cannot and we will not undermine the possibility for people to take advantage of being able to move around. And mobility is, well, I don't want to say it's a human right, but I like to think about it as a human right. So of course, we on the EU level, we acknowledge that there are costs linked to transition, to energy transition, and we have on the table something which is called Climate Social Fund that will be using money coming from emission trading scheme, especially from the part that affects, that is in place for road transportation. And that money will be used by EU member states to address energy poverty and transport poverty. Mm-hmm. It's a new instrument, not there yet. Member states are asked to work on the programs that they will put forward to us, saying, this is how we want to use that money. And the idea behind Climate Social Fund is that we offer that the money goes back to the society, it goes back to the users, so that the costs of transition, which granted exist, especially at the beginning, can be balanced by providing either new mobility possibilities for people and small companies, or money to isolate their houses so that it can directly translate in lower costs for or lower energy bills. It's not a simple, it is a simple instrument. It will not be, of course, simple. It will require a lot of work on the part of EU member states, but this is the instrument put in place to address the question of just transition.
Great, thank you. Thank you for also sharing such a concrete instrument in this regard. So we've mapped a little bit the different policy needs, let's say, and measures. Let's perhaps turn to some of the technologies that we're talking about here. And Karin, maybe I can turn to you first. Can you dig a bit deeper into this topic? What are we've already touched upon some, but really from your perspective, from Volvo's perspective, the key technologies that we're talking about here for emissions reduction.
I think I have touched upon some of the technologies, and I think it's important here to understand a little bit about our value chain. So if we look upon our emissions from a value chain perspective, then, as I said, 95% comes from downstream. So when the products are being used, 4% is upstream. That's components and materials going into the vehicles, and only 1% is actually coming from our own operations or the electricity that we buy. So then you could ask yourself, if we want to accelerate emission reductions, where do we want to start? And of course, we need to start where we have the biggest impacts. So then we look upon the downstream emissions. And as I said, we look upon battery electric, fuel cell electric, and then the combustion engine with primarily then hydrogen, biodiesel, and biogas. Already today, we are selling both electric vehicles and machines. We are planning to introduce fuel cell electric vehicles towards the end of this decade. When it comes to acceleration, of course, we will need to introduce these types of vehicles at different pace is the word I was looking for, depending on region or market, but also depending on what kind of transport segment it is. So it's different if it's urban transport, regional transport, long-haul transport, etc. Volvo Group is present in 190 markets, which means almost every market in the world. We have as a target that for 2030 we are to reduce emissions from trucks and buses with 40%. So it's a huge challenge, and that will require all the different technologies. But if we are to meet that target, we really need to see a much bigger penetration of electric vehicles out on the roads. It's not going to be possible otherwise. But I also wanted to touch briefly upon the fact that we also want to decarbonize upstream emissions. And I think it's important because the more electric vehicles we put on the road, the higher the emissions from the upstream part of the value chain will be. So also here, we are starting with the materials and components with the biggest emissions. For us, that means steel, aluminium, polymers, batteries. If you take steel, for example, out of the total weight of a truck, 70% is steel. So it's, of course, crucial to be able to decarbonize steel. Here, we think it's really good to have different types of partnerships to advance decarbonization. For those of you that participate in the ministerial roundtable that we had, I talked about the First Movers Coalition, where we are using our purchasing power to get these both steel but also aluminium, near zero steel and aluminium in place, and to get them to the market. So here we are willing to make sure that we can bring these technologies in a cost-competitive way to the market, even though it will actually cost us a little bit more in the beginning. Mm-hmm. We have a cooperation ongoing with SSAB, the Swedish steel manufacturers, and we were able that in only 8 months to go from a prototype, a vehicle in fossil-free steel, to a vehicle that we could hand over to a customer. Mm-hmm. Today, if you buy an electric truck, you will actually have part of it being done in fossil-free steel. So I think that shows that if we cooperate, we can do things quite quickly. We will gradually introduce more and more fossil-free steel into our vehicles, the bigger the access is to it. I think another example is on batteries, where we are now starting our plans to do battery cells in Sweden, where we have a good amount of fossil-free energy available. So these are some of the technologies that will be really, really important for us in order to accelerate the decarbonization.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting to see also, how Magda just spoke about these industries, especially steel and others that we thought were so impossible to decarbonize, and the leaps we're making there. So let's keep talking about how we can accelerate these leaps that we need to make. Thank you for sharing that. And I'd like to come to the both of you because we've already talked about the supply and demand topic in regard to energy availability. And so I'd like to just dig a bit deeper on that and learn from you, Gianluca and Tanya, regarding the energy sector perspective that you both bring to the circle here, what the necessary policy levers are to ensure that really the variety of energy sources and technologies are there and available. So maybe we can add to some of the points that have already been made regarding supply and demand, and just from your perspective as energy suppliers, voice those policy needs a bit louder. Would you like to begin, Gianluca? Thank you.
Thank you. Several points have already been mentioned about what is needed, and I guess we're going to come back again on some of these points. I think the most relevant part is to address the common denominators that we have to bring these technologies, to scale these technologies. Especially, I'm talking, of course, the one from my perspective, the one of renewable fuels based on hydrocarbons. And on the common denominator, I would like to deep dive on one, because this is perhaps partially an overseen one, but perhaps the most fundamental. And is the feedstock. So when you rebuild, when you do a renewable fuel, you, in its most idealized form, you take the product of combustions, which are CO2 and water vapor, and through a process with a lot of renewable energy, you come back to the fuel and the oxygen that was used to oxidize the fuel in origin. So you need this feedstock. And if you want to make it circularly, so it means that when you burn, you emit the same CO2 that elsewhere is taken out from the atmosphere to be reprocessed in the fuel. The only way that you basically have a circularity and a neutrality of carbon, you have basically today two options. One is direct air capture, and we come from the same laboratory where Climeworks, one of the leaders in the space, came. So we know the technology very well, and Climeworks did amazing things in bringing direct air capture to the market and the reality. However, direct air capture is expensive. We are talking about several hundreds and typically in the order of 1,000 euros per ton CO2. This is a very expensive feedstock. So where else do you get a circular, renewable feedstock? The answer is biomass. From biomass, this is the only way that nowadays you have to come to a circular system. This is nothing new. I'm not saying you something that is not known, but what is not yet to me appreciated is how central this is. And also the fact that the traditional approach to consider biomass is a one where it's the energy that goes into the fuel that matters more than the carbon atoms, the precious carbon atoms that photosynthesis has taken out from the air. However, modern technologies, advanced technologies, like the one we do, but others as well, allow to use much more of this carbon. They have a much higher carbon efficiency in jargon. They make a much better use of the biofeedstock to produce fuels, and therefore need much less of this feedstock. Nevertheless, you still need a substantial amount, and waste is limited. Ad hoc grown crops need to be controlled. However, these ad hoc grown crops, these crops grown on marginal land, cover crops, something that the European Union in the modification, I think, is Annex 8, I believe it was updated now with this. This is very, very central. We are scared in a certain sense, perhaps also historically, from growing biomass for fuels because it was a right problem of competition of food versus fuel, which should not be there, absolutely not. And this has become a certain kind of taboo, but pathways exist to do this now, not in competition, on marginal land, severely degraded land, and provide the fundamental scalable feedstock that basically all pathways need. All pathways, independently of one, need to scale fuel production to the level that in 2050 we can cover the largest part, for instance, of aviation and the other sectors that cannot be electrified. So this is, yeah. one message that I thought it was important to place.
Yes, thank you. I love that we're also getting a snuck-in chemistry lesson here on the side, so thanks for both. Tanya, maybe I can hear your thoughts on the same topic, please.
A good chemistry lesson in a panel can't go wrong. Technology inclusivity and ensuring that we're not shutting the door on anything at this point. The enormity of the challenge we have in front of us, it is just such a big challenge, and allowing innovation to be fostered, which then allows investment to happen. And whether it's a solar taxi in Ghana or it's direct air capture, there are a lot of things, as the Director General said, that we didn't envision 10, 15, 20 years ago in the pace. And while we're still not happy with the pace and we're still not happy with the reductions, we need to keep pushing forward. If you look toward 2050, the population of the world is going to be nearly 10 billion people based on our best estimates, which means demand is going up, which means without intervention, emissions would go up as well. And transportation is something that, whether it's personal transportation or it's transportation for commerce, as economies grow and standards of living shift upward toward the middle class, we need all of these solutions to come to bear. So the big challenge cannot be solved by one solution. It's going to depend on where I am in the world. It's going to depend on what are the resources, the labor force, et cetera, available to me there. And it's going to require collaboration in order to not just advance basic research, but also the development of technologies that we see there, but that are very expensive, things like direct air capture, but also the deployment. There are some solutions there, but until we have them at broader scale, they are not going to reach those affordability levels that society is seeking. And if you look at the IEA, they identified 50 technologies that need to be on track for us to reach our 2050 goals, and only 3 of them are on track. So there are another 47 that we need to go after across all of the different sectors, even beyond transportation. And we need technology advancement, and you don't know where and you don't know when that advancement is going to come. It can come from an academic lab. It can come from government research. It can come from private industry. And it's really important that we continue to support an all of the above strategy to technology development, because we need them all. We'll need them in different places. And we don't know where that next innovative mind is going to come in and deliver something that we are very surprised by and that really takes us down the learning curve and allows us to scale at a more affordable level on a given technology. Within ExxonMobil, we've got about $20 billion earmarked for lower carbon solutions across all industrial and transport sectors. Part of that is energy efficiency. We haven't talked much about efficiency, but the best way to avoid emissions and reduce cost is to not use the energy at all. So anything we can do to make fuels more efficient, make the machinery and the hardware more efficient that use the fuels, that's going to be an excellent bet. And there's still innovations that we can have in the efficiency space. If we think back, just even basic residential commercial, you look at the light bulbs we're using today, they're totally different than what we were using just 5 or 10 years ago. So small things can go a long way. We also look at where is our capability, and our capability lies in certain areas, but other people have different capabilities. Gianluca has different capability, Volvo has capability, and a lot of the government research has capability as well. So if you look at where our capability is, it's in things that link back to our traditional petrochemical business. It's carbon capture and storage. We understand the geology, the rocks, how to drill very, very well. We understand offshore. We also understand how to make hydrogen, but as do others. And so whether that hydrogen is blue hydrogen associated with carbon capture, it's green hydrogen, it's pink hydrogen, if it can reduce emissions, it should be able to play. I would have never thought just a short time ago that we would be in the lithium production business, but we found an area that it makes sense with our capabilities and technologies. And we know battery electric vehicles and batteries for other reasons are going to be very prevalent moving forward. So We're in the lithium game now, and we're in the lithium game in the United States. We have some partnerships in Canada, and looking at some partnerships in Europe as well. And then lower emission fuels. That has been where we have spent a lot of effort for the transport sector. The clean fuels regulation in Canada provide the right policy environment, the right incentives, and we are now investing hundreds of millions of dollars in Alberta at our Strathcona refinery to produce renewable diesel in Canada. So that's very exciting for us. In France, we've had sustainable aviation fuel mandates that have existed and will continue to exist, very clear policy. And we're in the aviation fuel business in France, so it's given us a clear signal on what we need to do. And in our Gravenchon, France facility, we've done some work to co-process sustainable aviation fuel from renewable sources, from waste. And it makes us proud, and it makes that team very proud. Bio and marine, another area where we have been playing, we've been learning, but there is a market there and people are very interested. And again, the policy, Fuel EU Maritime, very clear what needs to be done. It's greenhouse gas based, it has a target, it's aggressive, but we know how to invest in that kind of world. And then you can look around the world, Europe, Asia Pacific, North America, other road fuels where we participate. So all of this is complementary. It doesn't matter if it's electricity, if it's a bio-based fuel, if it's direct air capture. But one of the things that's very important is let's keep the goal in mind. We need to reduce carbon emissions, and we want to do that as quickly as possible. We want to do it over the next 2 decades as new technologies come to bear. And one of the key ways to do that is through the use of lower emission fuels now that don't need additional infrastructure while that other infrastructure is growing, whether it's charging, it's hydrogen or anything else. Let's leverage what we have, and let's leverage some of these lower emission liquid fuels to get them into the transport sector more predictably and at a higher level so that the pace of our transition continues on.
Thank you very much. Comment for you, Magda.
So I'm not entirely sure that comment is very closely related to what Tanya was just saying, but you were talking a lot about technologies, and I was just thinking that one of the big challenges / frustration for a regulator is what's the best approach to new technologies, innovative technologies, and are we prescriptive or are we goal-based? Mm-hmm. Everybody's telling us, I'm sure you hear the same, be technologically neutral. But then the moment we are technologically neutral, you come back and say, why don't you just pick up one technology? It's so complicated when you're technologically neutral. So defining what technological neutrality means is pretty tricky. If we have the definition right, then good. But the bigger point, and I think objective for all, at least for many of us, is that I need to have a framework that encourages early movers, but doesn't punish early movers. And striking that balance right is really tricky, because I need the industries to make a bit of a leap of faith every now and then, and to have the courage to go ahead and to trust that 5 years later, I will not come back to you and say, you know what, by the way, we'll do it differently. And for that, this continuous dialogue, cooperation, but also really listening to one another is pretty challenging. And it's challenging at my quasi-micro scale of 27 relatively cohesive member states. It's a challenge multiplied by many times when it comes to the global scale. But this question of technological neutrality and not punishing early movers is something that, for me, is a bit of a KPI for the policies. If we manage to do those two things, then I really think we have a solid policy framework in place. I'm not asking you to tell me what I do. But
Yeah, Magda, such an important point you added there. Thank you for that, especially when this is such a politicized conversation at the moment, especially here in Germany, looking at how do we keep the focus and not at the same time lose openness for new developments and technologies in the field. Maybe you want to come in on the topic of challenges from a government point of view. I'd love perhaps to hear a little bit more from your perspective also on the global topic that you touched upon earlier, growing populations, high competition between sectors, and competition for resources. So how to face those challenges when you're contemplating how to make sure how this is a transition reaching all.
It's not easy.
Yes.
I did want to start by saying I appreciate your comment on, competing objectives. I think the last thing that we want to have happen is, a transition to a cleaner fuel and to electrification at the expense of food security. And I think the fact that is top of mind and that is something that's being factored in, I think is really important when we think of the issue of a just transition. And I think that, for us, I think there are a lot of competing demands. And it was interesting, as you said, home insulation. And I think when we think of the demands on fuels and electrification, it's not just zero-emission vehicles. It's transferring home heating away from fossil fuels into electricity, and industrial uses, moving from steam and other generated things to electricity. And so the demands are incredibly high, and the grid is currently, in Canada, is very lucky that a lot of its electricity sources are clean. But in major parts of the country, it isn't. And so how you have a transition that is truly carbon neutral is difficult because it forces you to make investments. And I think the government is looking at that. And I think part of, as you said, the clean fuel standards is an element of it. But there are, Canada has has a significant component of its population that's remote. And so how you include, Indigenous populations and remote populations in that transition is important. And I think managing the pace of transition becomes important. It's very easy when you live in an urban area to do that transition. However, when fossil fuels, your livelihood depends on fossil fuels, how you manage that transition and what I agree with you. I don't like picking winners because government is not really good at it. But how you work with industry and you work with communities to find a way to facilitate that transition in a way that is at pace, but it's also inclusive. I think that's one of the key challenges and one of the focuses that we do have for how we kind of uncircle the square of inclusion and transition at the same time.
Yeah, and from a faraway point of view, it seems that Canada's already led by example in some of the ways that you have included different parts of your population in comparison to other places around the world. So maybe also looking at how can we learn from each other and some of the progressive policies being made. Karin, you already outlined some of the challenges in terms, or also policy needed in terms of uptake of electric vehicles, especially also trucks earlier in regard to charging station, etc. So maybe you want to elaborate a little bit, but perhaps you can also link on to this point of the just transition. What are some of the considerations from a just transition lens to the topic of encouraging the uptake of electric vehicles, especially trucks?
Maybe I'll start with just commenting on something that was said here before, that I think that in order for us sort of to work together, for the policy side and then the manufacturers or the technology side to work together, I think something that we have been thinking a lot about is how we can increase our transparency towards policymakers. We need to be much more open about our plans, what we think. We might not have to talk about the winners and losers from a technology point of view, but to be clear on our plans, what we think we do need. I think if we can share our plans much more openly, that will be one important part really to make sure that we meet each other, because this is also a question about timing. If we have a full fleet available to be sold of electric trucks, but there is no charging infrastructure or there are no policies to make sure that we can bridge the additional cost between what is today the price to buy a conventional truck compared to a net zero truck, then it's going to be a little bit problematic. So I'll come back to the point on just transition, but just saying a couple of more words about on the policy side. I think that For us, the most important part is really how we can bridge this extra cost, both from a vehicle perspective, but also from the price of energy perspective. The price of an electric truck today, or a fuel cell electric truck today, it's definitely higher than of a conventional diesel truck. That price is most probably coming down, but it will take time. So, and that of course depends upon the price on the battery, but it also depends on the volume of the trucks. There are still not enough volume really, and we need to have a much higher demand for these solutions. So I think it comes down to the fact that it has to be actually for one of our customers, they are driving a business, either if it's a truck or if it's a bus or if it's a construction machinery type of equipment. Driving 1 kilometer on electricity must be either cheaper or at the same price than driving a diesel truck. Otherwise, it won't work. And you can use different types of policy measures. You could use a carrot or a whip to get that through, but somehow that is really what we need support on to do this change. Then coming back a little bit on the just transition, I think for us, the first step is really to make sure that everyone really wants to be part of this transition. We want the general public to want to transition, and if they are to want to transition, there has to be very few drawbacks for them. So I think from a company perspective, what we have worked a lot with is, number one, make sure that everyone is on board. We share our vision, this is our plan, this is why we want to transition. Number two, we don't want to create winners and losers throughout the transition, so we want people to be able to keep their jobs. So we are working a lot with upskilling and reskilling, making sure that people will be employable during the transition, but also after the transition. We also want to keep as much as possible the current footprint that we do have. So today, for example, when we produce an electric truck, that is being produced at the same line as you produce a diesel truck, which makes it simple and flexible for us, depending on the level of demand. But it also makes it very interesting for people to work in this environment. So it doesn't create a big... Then, of course, there are some issues with producing electric vehicles from a sourcing perspective. So to work much more with responsible sourcing is, of course, also for us part of the just transition. Then affordability also comes into this equation. But I would say that for us, working with our own workforce, making sure that they can actually continue and be dedicated to this transition. And then secondly, to make sure that we do responsible sourcing is critical in a just transition.
Thank you so much, Karin. I think actually all points fed in really well to the just transition discussion, because of course the equal pricing topic matters so much from a global perspective when so many global majorities are so dependent on moving goods by road, lacking rail infrastructure, etc. So yeah, Magda, what is it going to be, the carrot or the whip? And also perhaps I can ask you, we heard now so many points made on the charging infrastructure topic, another also politicized discussion, but clearly there's such a big demand side. So perhaps you can share a little bit what the EU is planning to meet the supply side.
Thank you. I think it's always a combination, a bit of a carrot and a stick, which works best. In terms of addressing a bit the price gap, I did talk about Climate Social Fund on purpose at the beginning, because one of the potential addressees of that money will be micro companies that exactly should have money available to bridge the gap when switching from a conventional truck to a zero-emission truck. But again, in the hands of member states, how they want to shape the money that is being allocated to them. But it's a type of funding that we haven't had available for quite a while. So that's why I'm advertising it right, left and center to member states and to industries. So it is not overlooked. I think this question about charging infrastructure is an interesting one. We have, and again, I do realize that EU perspective is different, but we have a regulatory framework in place, alternative fuels infrastructure regulation, that puts very clear mandatory targets in terms of density of charging infrastructure for vehicles, including for trucks, on the Trans-European Transport Network. Looking at personal vehicles. Numbers are picking up in the EU. We have, and I need to use my notes, we have 4.7 million battery electric vehicles, 3.5 million plug-in hybrid vehicles. In terms of targets that we want to achieve for 2030, we should have we should have in 2030 42 million battery electric, 14 million plug-in hybrid. Will we be there? Won't we be there? Let's see. In terms of accompanying infrastructure, there are parts of EU where this is going pretty well and the density is picking up. And there are parts of Europe where this density is not picking up. And here my chicken and egg problem comes into question, whether the infrastructure is not there because there are no vehicles. So those who should put that infrastructure in place don't feel motivated because they don't have a business case, or whether there are no vehicles because there's no infrastructure and those who sell those vehicles are saying, well, we will not do it. What we have seen, what we have observed in those parts of Europe where it is picking up, where we actually are getting enough infrastructure, is that there had to be a bit of initial funding and financing support on the infrastructure side. But now putting in place infrastructure for charging is a market-driven, well, it's not a phenomenon, it's a market-driven activity. Mm-hmm. And there we basically hardly need any additional funding and financing. But in parts of Europe, and I can imagine even more in parts of the world, we do need some initial financing scheme in place that will kickstart that deployment of infrastructure. We have alternative fuels infrastructure facility, which is a relatively simple financing scheme where we combine public money and private money dedicated to alternative fuels infrastructure. And actually it works super well. Industry representatives are telling us it's easy to use. It's probably almost the easiest funding program that exists. The mandatory blending between public and private money is also a good exercise for the future financing needs. But again, we are trying to create here an ecosystem that has not been in place before. So I'm also not overtly impatient. And I know that from the point of view of Volvo, you need to know that this infrastructure will be there. My answer is this infrastructure will be there, because it has to be there. But I think what's really important is that we do a regular stock-taking exercise where we stand to see whether this combination of a stick, and the stick in my case is the mandatory requirement for the minimum infrastructure, and the carrot in terms of first, some financing support, but second, also making it easier for zero-emission vehicles to go around Europe and have no access restrictions, whether that combination works or whether we need to tweak something in the meantime.
Okay, great. One important check already made with the session. Hopefully ITF can offer more space today and tomorrow to see how such a global scheme can be advanced. Felipe, I'd love to get back to the aviation industry. So from a consumer point of view, we've seen some really exciting uptakes by different airlines of alternative or cleaner fuels, let's say, and this makes a very promising atmosphere. Perhaps you can let us in a little bit more on how these new technologies, electric, hydrogen, we were expecting new shifts, right? We were talking about these innovation shifts. So how is the aviation sector, how different actors preparing for this? And am I right with this impression that we have a promising sort of new wave ahead?
You know, I was analyzing the comments, and I like the chicken and egg. I like the winners and losers. I like the financing approach, you know, because at the end, what we are talking is the same things with the similar approaches, but all of them are linked with we never wait that we need to start to make things happen, you know. As I mentioned before, I think in terms of aviation, sustainable aviation fuels is the crucial part to go for this transition. Because if you think we are a global industry, we need to start to think global in everything that we do. That's why when you go for setting targets for sustainable aviation fuels, you don't need to think about one part of the world. You need to try to think about the whole world. And that's why I believe that ICAO support on the implementation, on the setting global targets or ambitional targets are really very important, because that will turn that the necessity to do that is globally, not only regionally, And I think that makes a difference because we are a global industry. Of course, we have different parts of the world that have different needs. I always mention coming from Latin America, if you go from Colombia, if you go to Bogota, to Medellin, we have a 1-hour flight. Any other alternative way of transport, you take 12 hours, 11 hours, because we have the Andes between the cities, and there is no way that you cannot do in the fast and effective way if you don't do via airplane. Minister mentioned the northern territories, how we reach northern territories by train. You need to go by air, Islands in the Indonesia, thousands or hundreds of islands, you need to reach there. That's why the aviation sector needs to have a global approach, needs to think about that, and I think the first step is the sustainable aviation fuels. That's why, again, the chicken and egg will be one important point, the finance will be an important point, and we cannot have winners and losers, because in certain places, the aviation sector is crucial for that society, crucial for the social and economic development of that places. If it turns too expensive, it's impossible. And I don't think that you'll go back to move the world on the boats, aviation will continue to grow, will continue to develop in different speed, in different parts of the world, but it will continue to develop. That's why when you go to alternative aircrafts, let's say, we talk about electric aircrafts. We already have electric aircrafts. We have that technology to do that. The biggest difference is when aircraft, when they take off and landing, there is a big difference in terms of the weight. And when you have a battery, you have the same weight when you take off and the same weight when you land. That's why the technology for electric aircrafts that goes beyond certain number of the passengers is still a challenge, because we still have the weight of the batteries that you say is the same when you take off, is the same as you land. And that will be a big challenge, especially for big aircrafts. However, for small aircrafts, for smaller regional flights, that's a reality that could happen really in the near future. We are not talking about 20, 30 years, but will be limited for certain parts of the world, limited for certain airports, and that you need to have the both sides. You need to have an airport A and B with the same infrastructure to receive that. Hydrogen is the same. I think we started the technology, that's why the engines already can run. We have a big challenge in how we will accommodate the tanks that will fly in the future for the hydrogen as well. But it's also something that you need to start regionally. And again, we need to have the A and B. And the only thing I can always mention is that in the aviation sector, you don't have a parking lot in the space. That's why if you have an issue, you have an accident, you have fatalities, and that is an issue as well. So you need to be very conscious. Every time when you move in aviation sector, you need to be conscious what we'll do, because affect the lives of the people. And I think that's something that is important to mention. If you have an electric car and you run out of battery, you just stop and call someone to take you out. But you cannot do that with an aircraft. You cannot do that if you have a bad weather and you need to move rather than land in airport B, you need to land in airport C. And that happens, that doesn't have hydrogen or doesn't have electricity there. How will you do that with that aircraft, with that people? So aviation is a little bit more complicated. It's possible to do. Again, I think it will be 3 phases. I think it will be sustainable aviation fuels that is crucial and is feasible to do with the right approach from the 3 levels: government, private sector, and even the passengers, to understand that they need to do something. They include, of course, airports in the whole aviation ecosystem. Second one, electricity. Third one, hydrogen. And we will be able to reach, I'm quite sure, this net zero that we expect by 2050.
Thank you. Hope so too. And safety, of course, a really important aspect in this conversation, still also looking at the just aspect of what we're talking about. So thanks for that. So to close this round on alternative fuels, maybe I can ask you both, but you first, Tanya, on just a short sort of summary. You gave us this portfolio overview earlier of the different ways that you're working on reducing carbon emissions and neutrality. Where do you think the next levers are going to be in terms of developing alternative fuels and also advancing them in terms of uptake? Are they policy levers? What other levers will they be?
I think there are a lot of levers, but for the early technologies, it will start with policy. you do have to catalyze things moving forward. And we are very principled in ExxonMobil. We are goal-based. But we also understand that to get new things off the ground, you need a nudge, you need that catalyst. But eventually this all has to go market-based because governments cannot afford to pay for all of this forever. So if we want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we need to catalyze some of those technologies, and some are already well on their way. But it also will help bring down the cost as well, because the more people that are doing that, the more people that are driving innovation, the more people that are building more of the widgets we need to make the fuel, the cost will come down. It's just economies of scale, and we continue to learn. The transition is already in progress. It's moved a lot just over the last 20 or so years, but we all want faster pace, bigger scale, and we don't want that to lag versus the targets that we have. So when we start with policy, we need incentives, and we need clear goals. So setting a goal-based standard, drawing the line between where we are today and where we want to be in the future is very helpful. It makes investment more predictable. It gives us confidence in industry, and to provide some of those incentives to the early movers so that they move and start to catalyze that industry. That's definitely something that we support. That also just helps accelerate all the rest of us, so those willing to take on the risk get rewarded for it, and we continue to move down the learning curve. The other thing, I've said it before, having transparent, consistent and durable policy is very important. But we also realize that new things will happen, and so you do need to tweak policy. You need to make some adjustments. You need to adjust the annex for the feedstocks when you realize there's something new that has emerged and could possibly be a solution if done correctly. But because we can't rely on government forever, we need the goals, and we need those to be set. We need to start and catalyze the movement of new technologies. But then what we need is the market, and it has to be broad deployment, which brings costs down, and it makes it something that society can afford. And we have to keep society engaged, because it's going to be a long road ahead of us over the next 20, 25 years. And we have to keep them engaged. So we need certain things to start on the learning curve, get on the learning curve, come down in cost, so that we can then focus our policy incentives on the next generation of technologies, the next generation of things that will reduce emissions. And so coming back to, let's focus on the entire life cycle. We'll focus on the fuel. We focus on the machine or the vehicle or the plane or the ship, looking at a full life cycle analysis so that we're truly meeting the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions across the planet. And then you have to monitor it. You have to figure out a way to measure and monitor and make sure you're getting what you're asking and marching toward the goal. Clean fuels regulation in Canada is a good example of that. I think also I mentioned the Fuel EU Maritime, good example. Set a goal, provide some incentives, and people start moving, people start investing. And I think especially for some of the things where the infrastructure is available and we don't need a lot of new investment, we don't have to play chicken and the egg, those can reduce emissions quickly. I'm hopeful that as we get to revisit some of the policies here in Europe, we'll bring more than just a tailpipe view, and we'll start to bring more of that life cycle view to whether it's light duty vehicles, heavy duty vehicles, but we just need it all. I think also the things that are relatively affordable to invest in now, let's go make it happen. They can make an impact now. They can start to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And all of this is underpinned, no matter where we are in the world, with just an overall positive industrial investment environment where any innovator, any big company, any small company just has the right framework. And it's not just about sustainable policy, it's tax, and it's permitting and making sure that we can permit new technologies and get them on the ground as quickly as we possibly can. So there are a lot of things that can really make just industrial investment a positive thing, and those are the countries that will attract investment. And we see some challenges here in the EU just overall, particularly the petrochemical industry, but again, opening some dialogue to understand that we need to make this energy transition, but we're going to need industry to be along with it, and we need the policies to support it.
Thanks. There were a lot of points in there, and some things we didn't quite get to in our discussion. The metrics that I just touched on in my opening remarks, such an important point to have these common metrics and to be able to share data, to be able to share insight, and of course also have this common narrative of the future that we actually want to live in, that you just mentioned. So closing off this round, Gianluca, I mean, I would love a whole separate panel just to talk about how, for instance, the effects of AI are going to come in to develop new alternative fuels and what sort of the technical advancements are that you're seeing. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of a insight of the technologies that you need in order to scale successfully, and also maybe just a closing word on your wishes toward regulation in this area.
Yeah, I mean, I think the central point, and this was mentioned several times, is affordability. If you want that renewable fuels fulfill their role of becoming a central element of decarbonization, they need to be affordable for society, for the economy. This is a cornerstone. How do we make sustainable fuels, let's say, viable from the economical standpoint? I mentioned feedstock. I'm not going to come back to that part. But there is another part. This is something that is typical of, in a certain sense, of the petrochemical industry where we all play, because at the end of the day, that's the play field. I mean, you produce a hydrocarbon. There are companies that have done since decades. And to do this, you need to make things big. You need to scale technology to large installations. Replications and serialization squeezed out some of the specific cost, but not all. The rest needs to be made big. Big vessel, big pipes. It's almost a topological thing that every chemical engineer knows, is that you need to do this so that the specific cost of production becomes low. What is the big drawback? Is that it's expensive. So a plant may cost from a pilot that is at a scale that, that you would say, okay, this is really something for babies. I mean, this thing would be still in the couple of 100 million scale. You need to finance this, and the technology has still risks. So you will either not get it financed, you may finance it through equity to your investors, as we do. If you want to go out and you even get it financed, you may not get good rates. So this is a problem. So you have large things, expensive things, however, still prone with risk, especially from the financing side. What comes then on top, and this was also touched, and you say it, Tanya, very many times, we need to have regulatory clarity. If I build something, if I am getting onto the adventure of scaling up at a cost of billions, potentially, a technology, and then it comes there and the regulations say, no, sorry, this is not anymore what we want. This is, we really need clarity. And this brings me to the main point, which have been said here, and I'm just repeating, and this is almost as a summary, is that we need to fund, we need access to capital. This does not mean a fonds perdu. It's always nice, but I don't think that is also right, as you say, that governments give their money, to scale things besides an initial part. However, debt loan guarantees, these kind of systems to lower the interest rates, this will, the weighted average cost of capital of the plants, this is an important tool because it changed the whole economics. The second thing is, of course, ways that ensure the market. And, the EU is doing this with the quotas. And you mentioned, the difference between the US, the usual carrots and sticks. But I think that the quotas are a powerful instrument. We see it in the industry. We see that it really helps. There are also sub-quotas. And here we go a bit about picking winners or not. Is of course a debate. There are, for us, very good reasons for having the RFNBO sub-quota. Others debate. I'm not getting to this, but it can for sure still make sense. And then there are, of course, also the subventions. There are, of course, the feed-in tariffs that, some people love, some people hate. And I'm just saying this is also a powerful tool. And finally, again, simply that the regulations stay, sometimes, and we have seen these, the cost, they don't come for free, and sometimes the unavoidable boundary condition force to drop this. This is, of course, a disaster when you have invested large amounts, large sums in this. On the other side, we know that the world is how it is, and sometimes this is unavoidable, but it should be avoided as much as possible, because this long-term thing, plants live 30 years, you spend capex driven, the cost of fuel comes from the capex, opex, with many technologies less an issue. If you don't have clarity of the offtake for the next 30 years, it's very challenging.
Thank you so much. This has made my life also a little bit easier. Pre-summary to my 2 cents of just summing up the, I feel, very rich conversation we've had, covered so much ground. So yes, policy, absolutely, we discussed, has a very important role to play to scaling up new technologies, encouraging the uptake, meeting the demand side, the supply side, and of course also the transparency, the predictability and transparency issues that you touched upon also in your interventions now. We also talked a little bit about the challenges being faced by governments, especially also balancing, keeping open for new innovations, new technological advancements, whilst really also keeping focus on the implementation and the rollout of the technologies that we need in place now in order to meet our carbon reduction goals. We also talked about combining complementary policies in this, especially in this regard. So this idea that we all have some sort of risks to take and some perhaps these balancing acts to deal with, but at the same time, we really need to keep focus on improving people's lives around the world and improving the health of the planet with what we're doing here. So keeping in mind the just aspects of this and keeping also in mind to make this inclusive conversation. So perhaps to see how we can share some of the innovative policies we've developed, sharing the technologies and the data around them, but also seeing how efforts such as you mentioned the Climate Social Fund of the EU can be scaled globally and really made available to people all over the world. So thank you very much for being part of this discussion. Thank you all also, of course, for joining the second plenary. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day at ITF. I'll be heading over to Hall 2 for a conversation on rethinking public spaces, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your sessions and, of course, tonight's dinner. Thank you.